Hello, welcome to the Big Strategy Podcast. I'm your host and fellow strategist, Jeff Hyatt. This is your go-to spot for real talk with the masterminds of business strategy. It's about sharing stories, insights, and those little nuggets of wisdom to help you unlock big growth. Let's turn the key and spring into action.
Clark, it's been a long time coming, and sometimes when there's so much anticipation, there's the fear of fumbling, but we're going to go forward with confidence here. Welcome again to this podcast that is as much yours as mine, in the sense that we're the co-founders of the Berkeley Innovation Group, and we were in the room where big things happen. For everyone's benefit, consider Clark my mentor and someone who I was his student many years ago. We won't say how many, Clark, but I have less hair, I will say that, than when I met you. And since then, we've had the honor and privilege of teaching together and working together over many years, and we're the two partners in the Berkeley Innovation Group. So, Clark, with all of that build up, no pressure, but it's great to finally have you here and sharing your wisdom.
Well, thank you, Jeff, and it's great to be here. You mentioned that I was your teacher a long time ago, and my sense of that is, yes, I was. And, over the years since we've known each other, formed a business together, and developed a great friendship together, those roles have reversed, so that I oftentimes am your student, just as you are mine, and that is one of the more wonderful dynamics of working with you and being friends with you, is that we have developed a wonderful capacity to both be curious, to learn, to share, and to lead one another, and to follow one another. And it's a source of great joy and pleasure for me to be all these things with you.
Thank you. Well, I return the sentiment, so thank you. So this first part of our conversation is really setting the stage and synthesizing 15 plus years of experience in design thinking. And your creative pursuit goes much further back. But in the principle of design thinking, I think as we've known it in a business school context, you are a graduate of UC Berkeley's College of Architecture, the architecture school at UC Berkeley, and design thinking has its roots there. So just for posterity's benefit, what's the arc that you lived from, your time as an undergraduate to design thinking being part of, the core curriculum at Haas?
Yeah, well, it's a long story that I won't go bore you with again, but I'll give you the highlights. Design thinking, as its name suggests, comes out of the formal disciplines of design. And that process orientation exists in places like an architecture school, a product design school, a graphic design school. These professionally based schools that teach the formal processes of design as a problem-solving methodology. Berkeley was no exception. The joke about my education at Berkeley is that we learn a lot about theory and we're great thinkers, but we couldn't build a building if our life depended upon it, which may be true. However, I would substitute the capacity to think in designerly terms any day of the week for the capacity to technically build a building. And that's no dig on the technical knowledge of construction and architecture. Moreover, it is a celebration of learning deeply into your bones the design process. And so when I was in architecture school, it was just at the end of the careers of two remarkable professors at Berkeley. One was Horst Rittel, who was a German architect who came to the U.S. post-World War II. And he was the first person, along with a man named Wes Churchill, who formulated the essential idea that architecture or design is a social activity. And as others grew into following those ideas, it slowly emerged that design is something that could be used beyond, as I used to joke with my architecture partners, beyond the building line. And so it is. When I was then a young man starting my career in New York, I had a design firm. I was an architect. And we also did visual design. I met a man at American Express who taught me a valuable lesson, which was that architecture and design process could be used to solve strategy problems. Two things happened about that. One was we could solve strategy problems, and strategy paid 5 times as much as design.
The man who famously taught you and thus taught us, if all else fails, add a zero.
Add a zero. And the essential part behind the curtain was that we were doing the exact same thing. So when I returned to the Bay Area and began teaching at the architecture school, I started a class called Beyond Buildings, New Sites for Design. And as that gained some momentum, along with a lot of other people, in the Bay Area and across the country that were doing this thing that came to be known as design thinking, starting in 2008, IDEO, the consulting firm and product design firm, coined the phrase. And as you and I often say, it's a bad name for a really good idea. And that essential idea is that we can use design process to solve problems in business, in civil society, in government, and in social contexts. And the history of design thinking, which may be 30 years old, is the history of people using design to do things other than buildings, products, and other things that, as my friend Arnold Wasserman says, ultimately end up in the landfill.
And the self-deprecation never goes away, does it?
You found.
So, Clark, for the uninitiated, what did you learn about being an architect, or what are the skills that architects use that can be applied to business strategies? They seem a world apart. How were they brought together?
They do seem a world apart at first. And just to clarify, it is the world of architecture and architects, but it's also the world of industrial designers or anyone else who studied formally the processes of design. Some of those things that I'd like to talk about are durable or enduring qualities of how we think. And you and I call this the mindset. Some of those durable ways of thinking, or what we like to say, the capacity to learn to think differently, are mostly rooted in a heightened capacity for empathy for a user or a customer. That is the ability to understand and resonate with the life or the circumstances of someone for whom we are working. So empathy. And empathy is a word that's fairly well known, but I'm not sure entirely well understood, because at the root of empathy is a sense, a willingness, a courageousness to live in a more vulnerable state of mind where you actually don't know everything and you're comfortable saying that. So in that openness to learning, that curiosity, we find so much rich information about a problem, a person, a community, a need, an unknown, perhaps felt but not expressed need. And it is the process of listening, of developing empathy for a user, and getting out of your own way. Now, I often joke and say that in architecture school, we studied hubris. And you do a little bit of unlearning to develop the capacity to deeply empathize with a user or a client. That's one thing. Another is this idea of curiosity, Jeff. And you are a great practitioner of this. Curiosity is the capacity to authentically and earnestly learn new things. You've said something that I want to share with our listeners, and that is that when you switch from curiosity to judgment, you stop learning. And when you think about that, it's very true. Once I make a decision about something, I'm no longer learning about it or curious about it. I've decided. And that's probably the worst trait of non-design thinking mindset, is that we think we know more than we do. So curiosity and open-ended eagerness to learn more, to follow things down the rabbit hole, if you will, to continuously be amazed at what people's lives are like, what people's issues or problems or constraints or skills and dreams are about. So curiosity. And curiosity is absolutely the opposite of judgment. So those are two things, Jeff, that I think are essential bedrocks. I could talk about some others if you'd like.
Well, I would reflect on empathy and this idea that there's two types of empathy. There's cognitive empathy, being saying that I've seen a movie, I've read a book, I've heard a podcast of someone who's been through that situation. And so that's difficult. But there's emotional empathy where you take the time to actually put yourself on that person's side of the table. And not that you need to necessarily feel the depth of their feelings. That's, probably impossible. But to, again, have empathy or an appreciation that their experience through, or their feelings through the same experience might be different than yours. And we always talk about starting with desirability, and desirability is just another word for, the needs of users, which start with empathy. So I touch on that. The curiosity piece, as you share, is so important in that we always talk about the traveler's mindset. And when you get off the plane in a new destination, right, it smells different. Maybe there's a different sounds over the loudspeakers. You may see just at the airport, there may be a different brand of candy bar for sale, or you can't read the label on the candy bar, and and how much more do you rely on pictures and signage and iconography to guide you through things? So these curiosity paired with empathy is really a very powerful duo, if you will, whether you're within a large corporation or you're a startup and you're trying to differentiate yourself from the competition. This seemed to be fundamental to me. It seems that's what you're saying as well.
Well, of course, I completely agree with that. And when you begin to talk about emotional empathy, it leads us into not necessarily an examination, but an embracing of this deeply human aspect of trust and vulnerability. And that's hard for some of us to get out of the way of, if you will, because if we're not willing to be curious and to be somewhat vulnerable about what we do and don't know, and that includes our biases and our feelings and our egos, then we restrict our capacity to be good at this work. So the notion of vulnerability, what is it, or what is it? Well, it sounds like truth, and it feels like courage. And we don't often, in the daily course of our work, find ourselves in situations where we either are forced to feel that vulnerability or willingly enter into it. And this goes back to the idea of the mindset as the core contribution of design thinking to the world of business. And I just think that's a real important pause point for us in our conversation to acknowledge that it's not easy, and it is essential to have that quality of authenticity and vulnerability in learning about people. And in the process, we probably learn a little bit about ourselves as well.
So when doing this work and we say things like trust the process, do the work, it is trusting the vulnerability that comes along with this work. And that's where great things are found. Beyond empathy and curiosity, Clark, what other elements of the mindset would you point to as really being critical to doing this and doing it well?
Yeah. Well, Jeff, I think one of them is the idea that we have as a basic mindset, a sense of optimism that no one, and it's not about design, it's just anybody who sets out to solve a problem or make something better, we feel like we're going to create something that's better than the status quo, the thing that already exists. There's an onboard sense that I'm going to make something better than it is already. That's the nature of even the germination of design, is we're going to create something better in the world. There must be a better way. And so without that, I never talk to people who students or professionals who say, we want to make something worse. or
I can't wait to screw this up today.
Yeah, I can't wait to make something terrible. No, it's never that way. So optimism, while it's a given, it's like table stakes, but it's rarely discussed as a mindset dimension. So I would like to just add that for clarity, that optimism is one. Another is the idea of what we do with ambiguity. In today's world, and certainly this has always been true, but it's more focused today with the advent of big data and the certainty of large language models, and we're used to getting a precise answer. And once we get those fast and precise answers, we tend to move on and utilize
They
them.
can be very addicting, can't they? That's what I found is it can dampen curiosity. The certainty can dampen curiosity.
Absolutely. I agree with that. I love using AI, but I miss the uncertainty of the messy process of coming to insights or to solutions. And it's so easy to write a few prompts and coax, a good idea or a good design or a good illustration out of the AI. But part of that ease of use is that we're never uncertain. That sense of ambiguity doesn't exist. And I'd like to suggest that having ambiguity in a problem set or a solution or in the realm of a complex problem gives us an opportunity to do something that more direct solution models don't. And that is to sit with the problem for a little while, to be confused, to be overwhelmed with too many ideas, to have a large data set that you don't quite know the meaning of. And I know this is counterintuitive, but having leveraging this idea of ambiguity is a giant asset to a creative thinker, therefore a business problem solver, because it allows us the capacity to continuously challenge our own thinking. And it is uncertain. And that's why it has the capacity to marginally improve an idea and sometimes fundamentally improve a solution or even the question, so that the existence of ambiguity, the state of not knowing, is thought to be something that makes people emotionally uncomfortable, and it is. But it's also the opportunity to think longer, to search more, and to find in those quiet moments, we talk about the innovator's suite of the shower, the nap, and the walk in the woods, to find the eruption of new ideas, of new connections, of new broad lateral thinking that create fundamentally powerful, good, new ideas. And that's the power of ambiguity. It's not that it makes you feel uncomfortable. It's that it makes you think more deeply, powerfully, and comprehensively, and therefore come up with better answers to those complex problems that we work on.
I think it goes back to that idea of just allowing your subconscious mind to engage.
It does.
That's where I find the best ideas come from, are those you can have mental models that help you expedite the process, but there is no, magic wand, if you will, for just simply sitting in that not knowing mind in ambiguity, trusting your subconscious to reflect on the entirety of your lived experience, knowing that there's probably a good answer sitting somewhere in there.
And just to build a little bit on that, my experience thus far with large language models or big data driven trends or aggregated knowledge in that format is that it is still a uniquely human capacity to be able to make that aha moment leap to a new idea that, we often talk about, this is never before seen work. And the human mind, in its marvelous complexity, is able to make some connections that are irrational at first, but turn out to be quite powerfully comprehensive as a solution. And it may come in time that the AI can think in that way, create in that way. But thus far, it doesn't, and humans do. And so that's a really powerful and interesting and important capacity. But I want to say something about that, if I could, Jeff. Not everybody is able to, as you say, sit with a problem and conjure and let new ideas erupt through the process of relaxing through the idea. I don't know that it's the onboard capacity of everyone. And I've developed an appreciation for design thinking and the people that think like designers, i.e. designers, who are more experienced, not better or worse or more creative, but more experienced with these models and these processes, so that when I find, or you find, ourselves in this sea of ambiguity with the experiences we've had, we don't run away from it, or we don't say, I'll never figure this out,
right?
Or we don't say, it's impossible, or it makes me feel too nervous, I don't want to do this. But a young practitioner does have those feelings. And we both said this in teaching together, that the difference between us and an 18-year-old learning this for the first time is that we, something you said earlier, we've done it enough that we can trust the process, knowing that we will get to those more clarified, powerful solutions and insights. But it does require, again, trust is generated by experience, not by reading about it.
Yeah,
So you go through the cycle lots of times, and then you begin to think, okay, I can do these things, or I didn't know I could do that, but now I do know that. And we know we can do it, as can all good design thinkers.
At the Berkeley Innovation Group, we are a strategy consultancy and AI advisory firm focused on mid-market companies looking to unlock big growth. In contrast to management consultants' typical top-down, hypothesis-driven approach, Big uses a curiosity-inspired, bottom-up approach, leveraging customer insights to drive strategy co-creation. Learn more about our approach by downloading our ebook at biginnovates.com/ebook. Now, back to the show.
We've really taken apart the mindset, if you will, and really looked at the individual components and empathy, curiosity, creativity, that comfort with ambiguity, optimism, so many aspirational traits, if you will. And those traits are really the foundation on top of which we lay the process of design thinking. So let's transition, Clark, and spend a little time on the process of design thinking. And as we know, many MVAs are taught, well, if I expand my knowledge base, but I'm still able to converge on the answer or the solution in the shortest amount of time, that I'll be rewarded for that. And as you and I often say, well, how do you know that you're asking or answering the right question? And so I may have teased the lead a little bit there, but talk to us a bit about the process of design thinking.
Yeah. Well, thanks. You teased it beautifully. So often in our human desire to solve a problem, and let's face it, humans are great at problem solving. What humans aren't as good at in their rush to get to a solution is getting the question right. So we're often brilliantly executing bad solutions. And I think that the short-term results of both business and society bear that out. Now, when I say that we often solve the wrong problem, that means we've asked the wrong question. And what does it mean to say the wrong question? That's a judgment.
Yeah, that's judgment. That there's an inherent judgment in that. So how do you respond to that?
Yeah. The unexamined question, I think, is the way to look at it. Is it, are we, when I say, are we asking the right question, how do we know if we're asking the right question? Well, there's a few ways of looking at that question, of if we have the right question. One of them is, we often say, what is the why behind the what? So there's a school of, or there's some tools called root cause analysis, or the 5 whys, or sometimes it's called a fishbone diagram. It's digging down deeper beneath the problem that is at first expressed and asking, why is this a problem? And so we go, our experience is that by asking, we say the 5 whys, we generally get down to a first principles problem, or a root cause awareness. And so what typically is wrong with our formulations of questions? Typically, here I am going to generalize without authority on this one, but typically it is short-term thinking, or we're asking a problem within the context of the known constraints. So in my company, I don't want to cast this problem as something that is a 2-year problem, or a problem with a budget requirement that's above $5 million, or some known constraint. I don't want to cast this problem as something that will destabilize my career, my boss, my department, my company. And I'm not suggesting we all need to destroy everything we built, but by asking, knowing what the real problem is, of course, we then deal with more fundamentally powerful and successful solutions. So getting to the right problem, we use tools like interviewing, observing, doing deep research in industrial segments or social society segments. We learn a lot. And we, with that knowledge, we are able to ask the fundamental questions of what root cause is. And with all of that data put together, we are able to formulate a problem that, when solved, will create a greater value for a company, a greater usefulness to a customer. If it's in terms of civil society, a greater policy that creates more equality, prosperity, education, whatever it might be. And I don't know that I'm being real articulate about this. You can tell me. But the idea is that we need to, when we ask the better problem, we get better solutions. And better solutions are better for whether it's shareholders or citizens. They're a higher quality problem and then solution.
I agree. And what often drives us is the sense of urgency to collapse time. So, and we've talked about this before, as if companies are required to report their earnings every 3 months, well, that creates an artificial compression on time that may or may not lead to the best outcomes. And so with that all being said, looking back on it, what's the real cost of converging without diverging? That cost tends to shrink, knowing that, whether it's directly attributable to Einstein or not, but it's that general idea that if I had an hour to solve a problem on which my life depended, I would spend the 55 minutes framing the question.
Yes.
And then solving for the problem. So all that is a long way to say that I think you and I agree there is benefit. So if I'm in an environment, I'm a startup, I don't have a lot of time, or I'm at a company and I am under these artificial time constraints, what are the tools or what are the mindsets that we can embody to just give us the confidence to go about divergent thinking?
Yeah. Well, to just define a little bit, divergent thinking is option creating. It's broadly thinking of solutions or ideas, and it's unconstrained by budgets or technical limits or political limits. And, we all could tell stories in business. The product that expensively went to market and was an abject failure. And many of us can tell our personal stories of products like that.
Like a paper sundial or just something to that effect.
Something could come up. But every one of those cases, almost without exception, the reason that they failed was that the people who were making the solutions did not take the time to get user feedback, to test it in any way, shape, or form. And they had such a deep infliction of idea infatuation that they believed, a prime example of this, that it would just be such a marketplace success that who needs to have user feedback to test it with potential users? And invariably, those products, and we could talk about Webvan, we could talk about, it goes on and on and on and on, of the products that were failures in the marketplace because no testing or deep development around user needs was done. So the point of that long-winded story is that sometimes you have to slow down in order to speed up.
Yeah.
And that's really the basis of diverging and converging, taking some time to learn a lot so that when you do solve or come to conclusion, you're doing it with a better question, a better answer, and better data.
Yeah, I think of it a bit like a rubber band. How do we holding it in that stretched position is discomforting or can be uncomfortable. But in reality, we benefit because that longer we can hold in that discomfort, the more robust the solution.
Wow.
So 2 questions. When do we know that it is time to shift from divergent to convergent thinking? And then how do we do convergent thinking respectfully in that it's not a headlong charge, but one where we're still open to that iteration and refinement?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the ways we know that it's time to shift from divergent to convergent is that we run out of time. In a very practical business way, that's the real answer. Another more satisfying, perhaps, answer is that if we're trying to solve for user needs, to identify user needs, we know in general in doing this kind of field work that deep, that is long and comprehensive field interviews with as few as a dozen people will generally identify up to 85% of users' needs. So that's one indicator. Like, as we continue to do interviews, we're hearing the same thing. We're learning the same thing. We're identifying the same pain points. So that's one indicator for perhaps we've diverged enough in our research. Another would be that we are a team, typically a team is working on this, that we are all coming to the same insights or conclusions about what we're learning. When we have a lot of common shared knowledge about the nature of a problem or the nature of a user and their needs, that's a pretty good indicator to move on. Now, I'll say this, when we start to converge, there's always redivergence in all of these things. There's no rule that says once we start to converge and do analysis on our work and extract insights from it, that we can't reopen the case and continue to learn more. And is, we often do that. So that it's not a system where you can never go back. So I don't worry too much about that. Frankly, we diverge until we run out of time, or we've concluded that we are onto something, that we've identified user needs and we know what a problem might be. And then we start to move toward solutions and prototyping. But here's the thing. If we get it wrong in the front end, we're going to learn about it in the back end. And then we can go back and continue to refine. This notion of iteration, which we didn't talk about earlier, but we certainly do, is we learn some feedback and then we will change our solutions and we'll try it again. We change our solutions. So we're constantly iterating or learning our way forward. At a certain level of practice, we don't really worry about the hard boundaries of diverging, converging, or research and insights and ideation and prototyping, because it's always based on feeding back what we learn as we go along the way, even all the way up to soft launches. We're oftentimes still learning, iterating, plowing our knowledge back in. And when you do that, when you take that extra time to get it right, you invariably have a more successful product in the marketplace. Full stop.
So when we've converged and we've kept our mind open, and is that, I think you've teased this a little bit, but I just want to emphasize the point that just because we've reached a solution doesn't mean that we've reached the solution, and that this is a continuous process. So some people use the double diamond process, right, where it's a series of diverge and converge exercises to come to that ultimate goal, which is having a product or service that delights and meets a user's centered need. We've spent a lot of time talking about the mindset of design thinking, the process of design thinking, and that I mentioned the double diamond method where we diverge and converge. And that leads us into some of the natural steps that this process involves. And steps in that process that Clark and I find ourselves spending time with are diverging and gathering research, and then converging on those user insights that we turn into how might we's. And then from those how might we's, we diverge again, visualize that second diamond of ideation. This is your traditional Post-it notes on the wall. And then again, converge through prototyping and experimentation to something that we can test with our users and get real feedback on. So that was kind of the high level, Clark. But if we were to go back to that beginning and think about research, why should we not trust what we already know? Why do we need to learn more about something?
Yeah, Jeff, that's a great question. It's not that we don't trust what we already know.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, put it a little differently. It's that we want to know more than what we already know. And when we are in that research phase of observation, researching what we call desk research, or doing field research in terms of user observations and conversations, we always think about that in terms of humans, people, customers, users, etc. But there are also, in that first observation phase of research, we often discover things that are not just about people and the way they behave, but oftentimes, it's about the possibilities of materials. If we were looking at solar panels, this as well as anyone, right now we're seeing the evolution, the discovery, and the testing of many different formulas of materials that can collect the sun's energy and convert it to electricity. everything from salts to different metals to new alloys to liquid collectors, and the efficiencies of these things are growing rapidly. Those oftentimes are the happy accidents of looking broadly in a research context around the things that exist. Now, you and I know Rich Lyons, the chancellor at UC Berkeley, but before he was chancellor, he was dean of our business school. And Rich is famous for walking around all day and saying, there's got to be a better way. And that's really the basis of that research. Whether we're researching materials, industrial processes, human behavior, finding user needs, that capacity for discovery, for finding things that we didn't know before, is really the heart and soul of the research phase around the design thinking process. Because if we already knew everything, then why is the solution needing to be improved? Right? So we clearly don't know everything we need to know. And that's the excitement of doing this first phase of research, is just to learn, follow our curiosity and learn things, and find those happy accidents that come along around different possibilities for materials, for human behavior, for human need. So that's that first phase. And then when we analyze all of that, or converge in the insight phase, we're taking all of that knowledge we have and finding those things we didn't know before. I never thought about it that way, things, and those become insights. It's the wow moments. We sometimes call them aha moments, as you know, and those are the most exciting parts of this, because it opens up then a new world of possibilities. But with all of that research, we then do converge down into formulating the second problem statement. The first one is when we first get started. The second one is the one that's informed by our research, by our insights. And that's the one I was talking about earlier, about a better question. So that is the use of the first research phase. We diverge into all kinds of knowledge, and then we converge down to finding meaning in it, ending in our revised, improved, more comprehensive, insightful problem statement.
And I find the insight part to be the hardest part of all of the work, because it requires us to peel back the onion, find that why behind the what.
Yeah.
And it's oftentimes opposite or counter to what we thought to be the case. So what does that mean? As an example, one time you and I were working with the Oakland A's baseball team, and they wanted to sell more baseball tickets. No surprise there. The challenge, though, is that they viewed it through their lens of, how do I sell more tickets through the axis of price? And where through our work, we came to realize that, people were actually looking at it through the lens of time. In the Bay Area, the customers they were courting didn't lack for financial resources. What they lacked for was time. And when you have limited time, you're competing against going to Yosemite, going to Lake Tahoe. Those are, a baseball team doesn't think of that as a natural competitor. But when you shift that access, have that insight, it really opens up those new opportunities that you talked about.
Yes. And in the case of the A's, the recommendation of having the free night of tickets, our confident assertion that they would make more money. Now, I should say this, they were only selling 7,000 seats a game. But by giving away the seats, which is completely counter to their way of thinking, because that's their revenue model, but by giving the seats away, filling up the Coliseum and making money on beer and gear, they would, in our model, generate more revenue, which they did. But it's that kind of thinking and that kind of story is about seeing what the goal is and finding new ways to get there. And that was, for me, the funny and fun part of that engagement. Now, of course, these didn't stay around, so I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's one way. That's one outcome where it makes you question your effectiveness in Newstown.
But they made money on that free ticket night.
That's right. Well, we can hang our hat on that, Clark. They made money on free ticket night. That was a good one. But once that insight is a tool that I like to think about, is if you just invert it. And I was working on a project just recently, and you can relate to this, Clark. The clients were saying, well, who else is going to come to visit our product? And they were in an entertainment business. So they had a fixed site. You can only get so many people into that site at any one time. And if we brought in more people, it'd have environmental impact and quality of life impact for the locals in those areas. And if we said, well, instead of trying to move that 1% of outdoors people who have visited your site, moving that to 2 or 3%, what if you instead looked at solutions to address the 99% of outdoor people who hadn't visited this site? And the solution space immediately expanded well beyond what they thought was where they had the right to play, if you will. We talk about that a lot in business school. Where does the company have the right to play? And by using this tool of inversion to find that user-centered insight, you can have confidence in that reframing because you know that it's based on a need that your customer has stated that you've uncovered in the interview and research process.
And Jeff, that example is a great illustration of the capacity to, we call this reframing, don't we?
Yeah.
To reframe the problem. And when one is inside of a business or of a market segment or just any contained vessel of where the thinking is common, it's a common culture. I'm guilty of this, you're guilty of this at Haas and other places. We just start thinking the way that the organization thinks. And it sometimes takes the outsider to come in and reframe for us because we're so used to thinking in a certain way. One is used to thinking in a certain way. And I think it's more rigid in some companies, especially the larger companies, this is how we do it around here mentality. So by thinking differently, the way that your story illustrates, we're able to see the problem in different ways and therefore see the solution in different ways. And I would suggest that all of the great leaps forward in business product and sometimes business operations are created by people who are able to step outside and see it differently and then discover new ways of finding solutions because you're solving a fundamentally different problem. In the case of your story, of an expanded problem, which inverted the market and created 97% more potential.
Absolutely. So when we have these insights, it's always helpful to reframe them as questions because, again, that's what invites that yes and thinking that we're so famous for. But it's easy to want to step over this important step, even though it seems small. What's the importance of taking the time to reframe our insights as a question, or I should say restate our insights as questions to invite, more robust solution set?
Jeff, I think, let's say I'm just thinking back to some of our own experiences with this. The importance of and we call them how might we questions. The importance of that question is that it is, in fact, the on-ramp to coming up with solutions. And so the ideation phase, where we're generating lots and lots of ideas, those ideas are generated by the question. So if we ask the question, how might we sell more light bulbs? There's an answer to that question. But if we understand why people want light bulbs, need light bulbs, and what they're doing when they have light bulbs on, we might find that a reframed question there might be, how might we enable people to do what they want to do, whether it's light outside or dark outside? Well, that doesn't imply that it's going to be a light bulb. It could be a lot of other things. It could also be non-artificial light. I mean, there's a million ways you could go with that. So the formulation of the question is what then inspires people to ideate. And if I say, how might we sharpen pencils better? That's a different question than how might we enable people to communicate? Now they're connected, but the second one is a much broader field of play. And the last point I'll make is we want our how might we questions to invite a lot of creative solutioning. We don't want them to be so narrowly defined that there's maybe one or two answers. A pencil sharpener.
The answer to a good how might we question shouldn't be obvious.
no, it shouldn't. You're right. If it's obvious, then we're not doing the job of design thinking.
Exactly.
We're doing the job of maybe efficiency or operation improvement. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the point I wanted to touch on. So as we move with this well-formed question, we get into ideation, which is one of the more fun parts of the process, admittedly. So tell us a bit about that. How do we, address that cliche of just sticky notes on the wall, right? That's not the heart of innovation. That's not where good ideas come from, but it makes for great pictures for the website. So where does true ideation begin, and how do we foster that from a genuine place?
I'm just thinking before I actually answer the question of the engagement, the consulting job we did, where we walked into the client, and the first thing that was said was, "Oh, there's those Post-it note guys."
There's the Post-it note guys.
Right. Well, ideation is to try to now answer the question you actually asked me. Ideation is the invitation to just make stuff up. And that's why the how might we question is important. And we always strive to have lots and lots of ideas. The main thing that people get tripped up on is judging those ideas as soon as they have them. So oftentimes it's self-judgment. Oh, Jeff won't like that idea.
Yeah, it's our self-censoring, right?
Absolutely. And there's a million ways to do that. And if you don't self-censor and you're in a certain brainstorming context, say in a conference room or something, if I throw out what I think is a wild idea, but a good idea, within a minute or so, I will have heard 5 or 6 reasons why it's not possible. Impossible to accomplish that idea. It's budget, it's quarterly planning, it's the strategy, it's blah, 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 blah. So the discipline of having the creative confidence to just keep ideating without judging is the key to having good ideas. Now, as we always refer to Dr. Linus Pauling's quote, the way to have a good idea is to have a lot of ideas, because it's kind of a numbers game. I mean, you and I have joked about this, that we make a living having bad ideas because 98 out of 100 are not useful. But those 2 at the end are, those gems are, that's money, man.
Yes.
And that's the thing. It's, you just have a lot of ideas, unconstrained thinking, so that you get to the good ones in the haystack.
Yeah, I think that's really well said in that respect. And it's just that simple quality over quantity. And as I love to say, it requires yes and thinking, not yes but thinking.
That's one of your most enduring famous quotes.
Thank you. Yes. Well, it's because but is a big eraser. That was great, Clark, but, and as we said, here's all the reasons that can't happen.
Yeah.
And we need to find that real sweet spot of innovation. And it's hard to make space for ideas that aren't ours, because so much of what we do professionally is judged on our contribution. The merit is based on what we've contributed, what we've done, not what the team as a whole elevated.
Mm-hmm.
And so what are your thoughts around this? Is some people lump this in with the mindset, but I think this is as good of time as any to raise the thought of the role of teamwork and collaboration in design thinking. It's, we say it's not an individual sport, but what's really the essence of that collaboration behind design thinking?
I think the essence of it, and we're actually speaking with one voice when we talk about this, Jeff. The essence of it, of the collaborative mindset, is yes and thinking, of course. But digging a little deeper into that, why is it better when it's collaborative? Is that each idea is individually formulated. But when I put an idea out into the world and then you pick it up and improve it, or morph it, or change it, or connect it to another idea, it's a force multiplier.
Mm-hmm.
And working alone, and we've all worked alone and had ideas, and yet with a team, a little bit of a sidebar here, I'm tripping over this idea. We know that good innovation teams, high-performing innovation teams, have 2 common traits. One of them is communication, and the second one is trust. Now, communication feeds trust, and a team that has communication and trust in their behaviors is going to be a successful team, because that gives me the capacity to be vulnerable and throw out an idea that maybe unheard of up until that point and never before heard or seen ideas, which is, by the way, what we're paid to do. And I can do that in a team knowing that you will pick it up or another team member will pick it up, improve it, shape it, or combine it in a certain way. And it's not so much that we can't do it alone. It's that it's so much better when we do it together because we have more brains on it and more collaborative joy in doing that.
I think that's one thing that's probably often overlooked is just that word that you just used, joy, is that there is that collective sense of accomplishment and achievement when you've found that insight or come to that top idea and everyone puts down their Sharpies and dots from dot voting and just gives each other a physical or metaphorical pat on the back. And like an artist, only an artist knows when the painting is done. Mm-hmm. And same goes for design thinking, is that when an idea is done. But that's when it's done individually, it's easy for questioning or doubt to creep into that dialogue. But when you do it as a team, there's that moment when you just know. And from our experience, that's what I really find to be the most fulfilling.
I agree. And another thing sometimes happens, which is you'll say a sort of a toss-off comment, and someone will hear that and see it and receive it in a very different way that becomes quite profound. We don't always know that the things we say, sometimes they're much more insightful than we think. and so it's you saying something and I recognize, or it sparks something in me or another team member that we don't always know the value of what we're saying in that collaborative, fun exchange. So the listening capacity of someone to help your comment spark an idea in me is also a source of probably 50 out of 100 ideas that come along. It's the building up of someone else had maybe laid the groundwork for.
So once we've come up with this great idea and we have that collective sense of accomplishment, it'd be foolish. I think our listeners probably know that that's not where you stop. So tell us more about what comes next in that process.
Once we've ideated broadly and found some ideas that converge down to, say, the promising ones, and I won't even put a number on that because it varies depending on the project, but we take our basket of good ideas and we don't just go to production with those. We go to prototyping. Mm-hmm. We build low fidelity prototypes, that low fidelity meaning fast and cheap, that we can take to users or to our other team members and tell stories and get feedback. And the fidelity or the complexity of our prototypes increases with the more knowledge we have and the iterations that we're making. So that eventually what starts out as cardboard and duct tape, the classic stereotype, cardboard and duct tape, soon gets into a form model if it's a product, and then a working prototype, and ultimately, a market testable prototype. Mm-hmm. So all the while getting user feedback at every step, because every time we increase the realism of a prototype, we get a higher level of feedback. So a smart person will run that feedback loop as many times as they can before going to actual production, so that the thing that gets made in production cycles is the best thing possible. And then you do some test marketing and pilot marketing, whatever the different scales of things are, until you decide, okay, we're going for it. And you roll out a product or a service that's been thoroughly tested, thoroughly prototyped, and incrementally built up to a market-ready thing.
Yeah, what I love about prototyping is that if they say a picture's worth 1,000 words, a prototype is worth 1,000 pictures. And you always tell the story of, kind of catching yourself and tripping over yourself. It's a thing like a thing. And then running off and building that thing and saying, it's like this, right? And you're famous for pulling a suitcase full of bricolage, or just, some might call it garbage behind you, but, just bits and bobs that you collect. And it's amazing every time we work, whether it's with students or professionals, how they take what looks like a pile of junk and through not only the physical creation, but more importantly, the story that they wrap around that creation, how that can bring, even the most abstract idea to life in very short order.
It's a little bit of magic, isn't it?
It is.
The other thing that happens that we've both observed is that people are taking an idea and turning it into a low-fidelity prototype, duct tape and baling and cardboard. The process of making also continuously fuels the process of designing. So that if I'm trying to make a prototype of something, I'm thinking about all of these elements, I'm realizing new things about it. And so a prototype does two things, gets us to think and imagine at a different level because of feedback loops and hand-eye coordination and evaluation and prefrontal cortex and blah, 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 blah. And when we're done with that, then we have something that others can experience and give us feedback on. So there's two levels of improvement that happen when we're making those funny little prototypes. And I'll just say one last thing. If I show you a prototype of this Sonos speaker and it's so finished and complete and beautiful versus I show you a for the Sonos speaker that looks like this, you're going to be able to provide a lot more feedback to this because you're not going to hurt my feelings because I've spent $10,000 and spent a week and a half building that other prototype. So the accessible prototype is the most successful prototype.
Yeah, getting back to, does your prototype allow for yes and thinking? And if you strive for perfection in your prototypes, you're going to get binary feedback. Yes, no, good, bad. Whereas the alternative is if you're designing for feedback, then yes and becomes natural. And the expectation of imperfection can actually breed more honest feedback and more clear-eyed feedback. Because we all have our egos embedded into the ideas that we're putting forward. But in reality, are we prototyping or are we in this process to support our own egos, or are we in this to meet the needs of our users? And when a team gets recentered on the idea of being present to meet the needs of their customers or their potential users, it makes a big difference.
It makes all the difference. I agree 100% with you. And you're such a good exemplar of getting our egos out of the way, because we approach it with humility, the humility that says, I can continue to learn from others. We then, just by the very nature of being that way, learn more, improve more, create better work, no doubt about it. So I agree with you 100%, Jared.
So Clark, after we've prototyped, we take that out to real users, right? We contact with the real world. And so when we do that, we always start with the lowest investment for the highest amount of learning. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the reason we do that is derived from exactly what you said. The highest amount of learning for the lowest investment. So fastest and cheapest and the highest feedback we can get. And we squeeze out as much learning from that low fidelity prototype that we can. And then we realize, okay, we now need to up the game a little bit and create a more sophisticated prototype, maybe different materials, maybe it gets to be a working prototype at some point. But each step along the way, we're extracting as much as we can in terms of knowledge and feedback from users or potential users. And that's actually a way to speed up the process, because you're not spending a lot of time and money on a precious prototype that you won't get good feedback on, which perpetuates the flaws of the design. And so you finally get to market with a product that's really not what it could be. And so that iterative use of accessible, fast, and cheap materials is, it's such a common sense idea. I'm surprised that more people, well, I understand why, but more people should be using those simple techniques with simple materials and prototypes to get feedback, because it's a little bit of a precious, a really wonderful process step uses non-precious things to get you precious knowledge.
I love that. Using non-precious things to gain precious knowledge. That's wonderful. So when we take the prototype and we go out and experiment, is it enough to put the prototype in front of the user and just observe how they use it? Do we take their explanation at face value? Or is there a benefit to wrapping that prototype in a story or to create some sort of narrative to walk them through the experimentation process?
Well, there's a lot in your question.
Yeah.
Let's try to unpack that a little bit. Certainly, we know that watching and having a potential user interact with the prototype is much more valuable than simply describing it to them. And they would say, yes, that sounds good, or no, I wouldn't use that. There is, as you mentioned, a significant gap between what people say they're going to do and what people do. And it's really legendarily large. So we use the prototype to simulate the product or the service and observe how people do interact with it. And we do oftentimes use, we won't be looking for a particular thing. We're also open to the things that we don't know that we're looking for that happen. But by having a user interact with our prototype, we're then able to see more specifically what does and doesn't work. And as an example, elderly people oftentimes are thought to be, they can't see, they need big numbers or they need real simple process steps and all. Sometimes it's true and sometimes it isn't. But by watching a person, if your intended audience is, say, elderly people, then watching them interact with the object or the process or whatever we're working on is really important because we're looking for the things that challenge our preconceptions. If I think all old people need big numbers, well, that actually turns out not to be true all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Sight impaired people need big numbers, oftentimes, but that doesn't mean it's only elderly people. There's also people with sight challenges at all ages. So by watching interaction and knowing what we're looking for, but being open to what we don't know that we are looking for, is a little bit of the art and science of using prototypes to develop and generate feedback.
Yeah, it's we always, as we said, the say-do conflict. You look at for how they interact and also how that interaction can uncover the biases that we bring to the table. These are all important things to think about when we're doing these experimentations. And stories around that, I think some people argue, well, telling a story is biasing the individual, and they're right there in that, and they feel a need to please the interviewer, right? So they might want to tell you what you hear. And sometimes it's valuable to outright ask the person you're interviewing, why wouldn't this work? Why shouldn't this work? What would be, if you gave this to your grandmother, daughter, son, uncle, whomever, why would they say this wouldn't work? And so being humble in that respect and understanding that the feedback that you get from people who will not be your customers can be as valuable as the feedback that you get from the people who are your customers.
Yeah, that's really well put. We learn from everyone in all directions.
Mm-hmm.
That's really important. That it goes to the piece about humility and curiosity. So often I think that I know what I'm doing. And as often as I think that, I'm reminded that there's always more to learn, that right. I don't know what I'm doing. And just a part about that is that as you do this enough, you realize that that's kind of the fun part of this work. Mm-hmm. Is that, I never thought about that before. And, I think I've thought about everything. And it turns out I haven't. And that's to discover the new things, the things that we don't know. That's really a fun part of this work and an essential part at the same time. But if your ego is all wrapped up in thinking, oh, I know everything and you're going to give me some feedback and I'm going to tell you why it's wrong, then my friend, you're in the wrong business. You need to go do something very quickly.
That's a good way to describe it. That friend, you're in the wrong business.
For example, I joke with the person that does our tax returns that I don't want him to innovate too much.
Yeah, this is don't practice what I preach.
Right, exactly. I don't want our K10 or whatever our statements are to be fiction. I want them to be accurate, etc. Because I'm kind of far afield, but the idea that we really are successful when we realize that we don't know very much.
Right.
And that's the purpose of design thinking is we learn our way into good solutions.
Yep. I love that. Well, Clark, I'll end this part of the discussion with the question that we always ask. I'll turn it on us in this instance, but what haven't we talked about in this journey through design thinking that, we should have talked about, or that those listening might benefit from knowing?
I was afraid you'd come to that, Jeff. Well, there are a few things that we're all probably thinking about these, but here's a few thoughts that I've been ruminating on lately. And that is, in the case of the field of design thinking, you and I have charted these journeys through this for a long time. And I often will look back on things that I've said 20 years ago that were true at the time. But when I think about them today or say them today, I understand that there's a lot more meaning and depth to some of those things. And part of the reason that that's true is more experience. Part of the reason is that the world is that these are not rare conversations anymore to talk about users and insights and prototyping and ideation in broad terms. For example, I think that over the course of time and also aging, I just feel a lot more, there are a lot fewer battles to fight around ego and things now. And saying something like all of our little wise principles of curiosity is better than judgment, to take one, it's so profoundly true on deeper levels 30 years later, because we've lived it so much. And it's become, all of these mindset ideas are not at arm's length anymore. We're not teaching frameworks. They become the embodied knowledge that we operate with.
Interesting.
And so trusting the process, doing the work, it's how I live. It's how you live.
Mm-hmm.
Finding good ideas and making them better. It was really smart back then, but it's really true today. And so the thing I'm so grateful for is having done this for a long time and done it with you for a long time. It has only affirmed and confirmed what we thought was perhaps true.
Mm.
Now it's embodied as how we live because it is true. And I feel like as design thinking's popularity, as a headline business story, it's fading a bit in the face of AI and big data and some other things. But its value hasn't faded at all. In fact, it's a wiser practice than it was 25 years ago, 20 years ago, 10 years ago. And it's more essential today because there's less and less tolerance for the ambiguity, for the fun and weird offshoot that creates a powerful, never before seen idea. The world, and I don't want to generalize this too much, but the world is sort of reverting to the norm and reverting to the mean. And it's more important than ever for people to be able to think broadly, think differently, get out to the margins, and trust those processes and do the work, because there's a greater reliance on linear thinking as opposed to circular thinking or curvature thinking. And so the power of design thinking has always been extreme, and now it's extreme and extremely important.
So you're saying there's no better time for big ideas?
I think that's exactly the best way to explain what I'm trying to say, my friend, just like you said it. And design thinking as a headline may not endure, but design thinking as a mindset and as a way of being in the world is every bit as powerful and kind of precious in my mind.
Yeah, I agree that it's more important than ever, or its importance remains and continues to be. It's really one of the superpowers that humans have, whether it's technology or what have you, comes to the table to try and take what is really our essence. Design thinking sits at the core, and it's been my honor, and I know it's been yours, to share this with this passion of ours with so many people around the world. And we're grateful for every one of you who have taught us as much as we've taught you, and knowing that we hope to hear back from many of you after listening to this and continue the dialogue. So with all that being said, Clark, thank you so much for taking the time and laying down some of your thoughts on tape, if you will, for posterity. And we will, again, we'll revise this and update it as our thinking evolves. But for now, I think this is a good place to let our thoughts rest for a minute and see how they age.
Jeff, it's always a pleasure and an honor to stand beside you and share thoughts and do work. And thank you for inviting me today.
Thank you so much.